Hi BookTube and welcome to a new video. Yes, it's yet another tag video. I'm afraid this is part of the corollary of doing massive maximalist reads where for 3 weeks of the 4 weeks of a month I have nothing to report. This is my reading life in 10 books tag, which was originated by Kelly, although ingeniously it's actually originated by a BookTube viewer called Victoria, because Kelly very smartly put out a crowdsource invitation for people to offer up ideas for tags, and she was absolutely right to pick this one. This is fantastic. So basically it's picked 10 books that have shaped you as a reader, really. So number 1, The Outsider and the Plague, both by Albert Camus. And I picked these because these are the first grown-up books that I read at the age of 14. And the reason that I found these are on any other book, I was also inspired to actually venture out into the world of grown-up books without pictures, was that I had an older cousin at my school who said, listen to the song Killing an Arab by The Cure and then go and read the book The Outsider by Albert Camus. You will score loads of cool and credibility points. And I promptly did both and loved the song, still do to this day. Loved the book, and that set me off on my journey as a reader. And indeed, the reason that Robert Smith of The Cure wrote the song Killing an Arab is because, like many people, he'd studied it O-level French, which is the exams you do at age 15, 16. And the reason this book is selected is because it's a very simple language. What's so powerful are the ideas in here. It's a book about morality and society and things like that. And it's also a book that sort of expresses the existentialist dilemma, really, and that spoke to me as a 14-year-old. I didn't know I was interested in existentialism and alienation, but I was, and this sort of put a name to it, really. So yeah, these are the first two. Oh yeah, so I was so impressed with that. I actually did something I almost never did and went to a library, took out a copy of this, obviously not this one, and I read it, and we had this sort of strange lesson at school where I think it was called Use of English, and there were about 4 of us in the class, and basically the teacher said do whatever you want to do as long as you're doing it quietly. And I think he basically just was marking, you know, papers from other classes he taught. So I sat in the class and read this, and at one point he looked up and sort of, you know, because obviously I was sat there are only 4 of us, the cover's sort of flashing in his face. He goes, are you trying to impress me? And I said, oh no, so I'm just into this book. But I actually was trying to impress him. That was really a grown-up book at age 14, even though I was so late to the to jumping on that bandwagon. And The Cure, in fact, did a song called Jumping Someone Else's Train, which is all about bandwagon jumping, but that's by the by. Okay, on to university. I studied history. While I was there, my university college actually opened a new library, but in the old library, which was very sort of higgledy-piggledy, and you never saw anyone in that library because it wasn't a library you could work in. It was literally a library with stacks of books. And at some point, you know, I was doing history, so I didn't have a lot of calls on my time in terms of the demands of academia. And I can't remember why. I thought, well, there's this library. I'm in a university, there's this library. Let's go and read something that I wouldn't necessarily be able to access. And I chose Franz Kafka, The Castle. I'd read The Trial. So I got this, again, not this edition, an old university library edition. Because this is quite chunky. This is 271 pages, but the edition I read was, I think, literally at that time, so in 81, 82, whatever, was because Kafka never finished any of his novels because he was always revising them, and it was the most sketchy of his 3 novels, i.e. the least completed of the 3 novels, the version of The Castle I read. So it'd be kind of interesting to read this and see how it gets to 271 pages, because the other one I'm pretty sure didn't. But anyway, and I was blown away by it, even though it's incomplete. I actually think it's a better novel than The Trial. And it's one of the few books I read, you know, nothing to do with my course, while I was at university, because I spent a lot of my time at university discovering new music, because there was a market in the town that I was at university at, and there was this record stall, can't remember what it was called now, and I just used to buy lots and lots of stuff and go back into my room and listen to it. So I didn't read all that much for pleasure until after I'd finished my exams, and that period we were waiting to graduate, when I marched down to the university library, not my college one, the university one, and I asked them for all the music papers from between 1978 and 1980, because I was doing research on the band Joy Division for a play I was writing. But yeah, this is one of the few books I read at university, and it blew me away. 3, I don't have this. It is the play by Samuel Beckett called Endgame, which is my favourite stage play of all time. And I was writing theatre when I left college. I wrote plays at college because the new library development also had a stage space for performance, and I wrote 3 plays in my time at university. And I left university having done history and really fallen out of love with it, desperate to do something creative. So I thought, I know, I'll continue doing what I was doing at university, even though there was no sort of safety net like there was at university, and that's write plays. So I was writing plays, I was going to plays, and I was reading plays. And indeed, I went up to the Edinburgh Festival in 1985 with 2 of my plays, and there was another group from our college which went up, and that was led by Sam Mendes, because I was at college with him, and he was doing Samuel Beckett's Endgame. And Sam Mendes knows his Beckett. It was a brilliant performance. Even though it's only a student performance, it was a brilliant performance of the play. And I just love it. And it showed me a whole different side of the possibilities of theatre, which up till then it would be very sort of earnest, people discussing ideas and politics on the stage, like all the Marxist British playwrights like David Edgar, Howard Brenton, David Hare, Trevor Griffiths, where basically everyone represented a political position and then proceeded to discuss it, and that was the play. Here Beckett was much more self-referential about theatre and artifice and reality versus fiction, and it caught my imagination, and ever since then that has been my interest in all forms of creative writing, in terms of not a realist. I'm much more the sort of self-referential, deconstructive type of writer, and Beckett was very symptomatic of that. And I do think that Beckett is probably easier and more accessible as a playwright than he is as a novelist. Okay, so book 4, The Room, Hubert Selby Jr. So I came out of university, I was writing plays, but I was still reading, gradually building up a head of steam. I read Burroughs, I read this guy, Hubert Selby Jr. And this is great, this book. It's very much stream of consciousness, interior monologue. A guy who's in a prison cell, so has very limited sort of physical space to traverse, and that sort of paces the rhythm of his thoughts and utterances. And it's very much in the line of, since being done by people like David Peace in his novels, but this was the first time I'd come across it. And it also sparked my interest in Americana, or at least in the deviance and underbelly of America, which up to then I hadn't really shown much interest in. And gradually I realised I was reading more and more American writers and less British writers. And my first properly performed full-length stage play was set in America, in a crack house. And I think tracing the roots back of that, this is where it all started with this book. As I say, the sort of dark, seedy side of America, and the fact of just being interested in America generally. Book 4, I don't have. I've messed this up. This is actually book 5, so I've actually got 11. Sorry, I've got number 3 in twice. So I've actually done my top 11. They have to forgive me for that. But book 5 I don't have, and they were the K. Scarpetta novels by Patricia Cornwell. K. Scarpetta was a forensic scientist stroke detective, because she often got involved in doing the detective works in her cases. And the reason these are on the list, because they're not great books, the reason these are on the list is when my wife and I had twins in 1998, it was like all hands to the pump for the first 6 months. It was like, action stations, the submarine has hit and taken on water in terms of trying to feed them, change them, win them, etc. And obviously there was no time to read. during that time. And what got me back into reading were these sort of no-brainer detective thrillers by Patricia Cornwell, and I shall always be very grateful to them. As I say, they're not great books, and I read quite a few of them, and gradually you saw that the criminals were sort of more and more forensically savvy, and they were sort of, you know, there was a lot of repetition of the precautions they took in order to foil leaving behind forensic evidence. Of course, they still slipped up, because otherwise how would Patricia Cornwell have caught the case Scarpetta have caught them? So as I say, they always hold a place in my heart for enabling me to get back into reading after a hiatus. And I would never read them now, but as I say, I'm very grateful to them. Okay, number 5, which is really number 6, is 2 books, very unlikely linked. One is fiction, one is non-fiction, but they both achieve the same thing. So the first is The Art of Death by Edwidge Danticat, which is non-fiction, where she looks at literary treatments of death, and also some personal stuff about the death of her mother. And the other, which I don't have, is China Mieville's novel Kraken. And the reason I've lumped these two together is because they have so provoked my ire that I've immediately responded by going off and writing something sort of in answer to them. So in the case of Kraken, which has some brilliant ideas, but unfortunately just throws so many different ideas against the wall to see what sticks. They're completely lost in a morass of a book. And at the time there was a lot of debate, why is China Mieville never nominated for literary prizes? You read that book and you know why, because even though he has all the talents and could very easily write a literary novel, which he has subsequently, at that time, you know, they were really ill-disciplined books, and I think therefore that excluded them from consideration for prizes. Anyway, so literally the day after I finished Kraken and virtually thrown it across the room, I sat down to see if I could write a literary genre novel, and it's called An Eye for an Eye for an Eye, and it contains three genres. One is sort of mystery detective, one is paranormal, and the third is post-apocalyptic stroke dystopia. And what I was really doing, and I was bringing literary values in terms of the language and sort of metaphor to them, but I was also subverting those genres at the same time. And I hadn't done any preparation for it, because it was literally the day after I finished Kraken. But obviously some of the seeds had been swimming around my head. I couldn't pluck it out from nothing. And it just so happened to be around the first week of November, when there's that NaNoWriMo, whatever it's called, you know, write a book in November. Now, I didn't formally join it, but I sort of shadowed it. And by the end of the Christmas holiday, I had the completed first draft. And yeah, so I wrote it sort of driven by fury, in response to Kraken, really. And similar with this, I disagreed with virtually every single argument in this book. It really annoyed me, because death is something I take very seriously in my contemplations and considerations, both as a writer and as a human being. And I did a booktube video on this book, 25 minutes, going through each argument that I disagreed with. And then about 6 months later, maybe longer than that, I was having what's called, is it called existentialist therapy? Anyway, it's a form of therapy, but it's not psychoanalytical. It's more sort of about it encompasses being, existence, and death. And I had 6 months of that, and during the course of that and what we were discussing and stuff, I came back to thinking about this book, and I thought, I've got a book in me on this, finally, because the thing about death, contemplating your own death is always far too terrible and overwhelming to actually sit down and do it. But I thought, actually, I am sitting down and talking about it. So why don't I finally try and contemplate my own death by writing a novel, or as it turned out, a novella. And it was, again, sort of informed in opposition to this book. So they're 2 books that have shaped me as a writer as much as a reader. you're told don't tweet while angry, but I'm quite happy to write novels while angry. It spurs me on. Okay, 6, which is really 7, is Our Tragic Universe by Scarlett Thomas. So I am a non-linear reader and writer. I don't like books that are just, you know, starting point A, middle bit B, end point C. I mean, those books don't really interest me. And what I love about this book, which is deeply flawed, but what I love about it is it's looking for the storyless story, non-Western approaches to narrative, be they in the Far East or be they sort of indigenous Native American, Native Canadian, Eskimo, all that sort of thing. And it's a book in which not much happens, and if anything does happen in terms of an event, it happens off the page. Scarlett Thomas doesn't tell you about it. You only find out about it in the reactions of people after the event. And it is so thought-provoking about the assumptions we make about storytelling, and so quotable. There are so many wonderful things to quote in here. And my favourite of all is, we should have stories not to tell us how to live and turn our lives into copies of stories, but to prevent us from having to fictionalise ourselves. And this condensed a lot of my sort of stray thinking on story and narrative and all this sort of thing, non-linearity. And indeed, my new book in July is called Stories We Tell Our Children. So there must be a link back to this book, I suspect. Okay, book 7, which is really book 8, Mark Danielewski's House of Leaves. I've talked about this recently. I'm not going to talk about it too much here, but it is what I call a spatial, architectural novel in sort of how letters and words are laid out on the page. And that gave me an introduction into, it isn't just things like, you know, non-linear narrative. You can actually do things with the language in terms of the alphabet and the layout, how it looks. And my book, 3 Dreams of the Key of G, plays with that as well. Not to the extent that Danielewski does, so I was doing it on a cheap budget, on a Microsoft Word document, which is fairly limited in what you can do. I will say that currently I'm writing some pieces which revolve around the layout of words on the page, and I'm actually paying someone to do the layout for me, because I can't even begin to approach that. So that sort of gave me another string to my writing bow in terms of spatial arrangement of text and layout on the page. 8, which is really 9, Ben Marcus, The Age of Wire and String. So this just rips all our comfortable assumptions about language, what it does and how we use it. It just shreds them and opened my eyes to, again, language, the possibilities of language as a writer. It's an extraordinary book. It's because it's using language in a way we're not familiar with using it, makes it quite hard going, but actually there's a strange poetry to these words that don't fit together. Well, they do fit together in terms of grammar. They obey all the rules of grammar, but they don't fit together in terms of, well, that word shouldn't follow that word because it doesn't make sense. But as I say, out of that comes a strange, beautiful poetry. Book 9/10, my favourite novel of all time, which I only read 3 years ago. This Is Not a Novel and Other Novels by David Markson, which showed me that all the comfortable assumptions about what we mean by a novel and what we mean by fiction, it completely subverts them. And when you've read this book as a writer, you realise that anything is possible. You tell yourself idly that anything's possible, you can write whatever you want, but you read a book like this and you realise what that actually looks like, what that actually means. It's just genius. And I'll leave the link to the Paper Trail podcast where I was a guest talking about this. And finally, book 11, apologies for going one over the top, The History of History, a novel of Berlin by Ida Hattemer Higgins, which was the first book I ever talked about on BookTube, although when I posted my video I didn't know there was this thing called BookTube, so I didn't know I was posting to BookTube. It was only retrospectively when I found out about it that I went back and re-tagged this as BookTube. But anyway, this is the first video I did on YouTube talking about books. It's not a book that's terribly well known. The author, as far as I know, has not produced another novel since this. When was this published? Published 2011. It's only 10 years ago. And it's a book about two mothers. One is Magda Goebbels, who in Hitler's bunker, she and her husband gave cyanide to each other and their 4 children to prevent them being captured by the Nazis. And it's also a Jewish mother who's trying to protect her children during the Holocaust. And both tales are sort of investigated by a woman living in contemporary Berlin who is pretty deracinated and doesn't have a sense of place and roots herself. So in that sense, you know, it's not a brilliant novel, but there's some wonderful ideas in here. And one of the things she writes about is, what is the difference between throwing a knife that sticks in a door and writing and describing the action of throwing a knife that sticks in the door? And of course the answer is time, because the act of throwing a knife is very violent, fleeting, you know, takes a second, and then, you know, the knife may wobble in the door. Whereas writing about it, describing it, if you're going to go into any detail, the process of reading about this act takes a lot longer than the act itself. And that seems to me to be the heart of the questions of realism in novels. That the moment you describe something in words, you're elongating it in terms of time. Or you could be foreshortening it because you're making selection choices of what to include or what not to include. So if there was something that was taking a long time, for instance, a baseball game in Philip Roth's The Great American Novel, you know, that takes 3 hours to complete. The bits concerning the game do not take you 3 hours to read. So, as I say, to me, this crystallised, you know, the debate about, you know, the nature of realism and the nature of fiction and fiction's ability to portray realism. I'm totally against realism. I'm not a realist writer. That doesn't mean I'm a fantasy writer or a, you know, and absolutely not. I drill down to the level of words. I operate at the level of words and alphabets that spell those words. So I reject realism as a writer. I'm also not very interested in straight realism reads as a reader. So, for example, the works of John McGregor, which are very minimalist takes on everyday life, I'm not interested. You know, I just don't get on with them at all. You know, I'm interested in novels that are aware that they are novels and that they indulge in the artifice of novels, that they indulge in what language can do and not do. That is always my interest as a reader and as a writer. So a lot of that stems from this beautiful expression of the conundrum of realism in fiction. So there you have it. Thanks very much to Kelly and particularly to Victoria for that tag. I hope you find that enlightening. Again, apologies for my screw up that I actually ended up doing 11 books. That's because on my list, as I say, I wrote number 3 in twice. Duh. Okay, till next time. Thanks very much.